This is All India Radio. 11th December is International Mountains Day, and we have with us Stephen Alter, the author of over 20 fiction and non-fiction books, who was born in Mussoorie, Uttarakhand, India, and much of his writing focuses on the Himalayan region.
Mr. Stephen Alter, you have been doing a lot of work for the mountains because you have a passion for the mountains, and you've written a lot of books that speak about the mountains, your most recent being The Wild Himalayas. Tell us more about what you have done.
Well, thank you for having me. I was born in Mussoorie. Mountains are my home, and this is where I feel I belong. And many of my books have focused on mountain landscapes, mountain people, mountain culture. And in recent years, I've been writing more and more about the natural history of the mountains. And one of the things that has fascinated me about the Himalaya is the fact that there is such enormous diversity. I mean, there's, of course, biodiversity in terms of different species of plants, trees, birds, insects, mammals as well. And that diversity has always fascinated me. And as you move across the Himalaya, as I've done while I was researching my most recent book, Wild Himalaya, but also others, what is interesting is the way in which the bird life, wildlife, the plant life changes as you move, for instance, from east to west. So the birds and animals that you find in Arunachal Pradesh are, of course, very different from those that you might find in Kashmir or Ladakh. And I think it's that diversity which is what makes the Himalaya such an exciting landscape for people to visit, whether they're visiting as tourists, or visiting as bird watchers, or whether they're as scientists, whether geologists or climatologists. And for me, as a writer, as a storyteller, I think that is one of the fascinating aspects of the Himalaya, this wide array of different species. And what comes with that each of those species, landscapes, cultural groups of people have their own stories to tell. And when I'm writing about the Himalaya, what I try to do is to combine both the narratives that come out of mythology and folklore with the narratives that come out of science and other scholarly investigations of the Himalaya. So when I find a local myth or a story out of folklore, I try to connect it to the particular species that are found in that particular area. And that, to me, is one of the most fascinating and intriguing aspects of the Himalaya. Another example that I can give you of the kind of things that I focus on in my work is when we look at the mountains, we often think of them as eternal. But the truth of it is that the Himalaya are constantly changing. They have been changing from the moment they were born, when the tectonic forces, when continents collided and pushed these mountains up towards the sky. They, in a sense, the rocks, the soil, the entire landscape itself was rising up and moving. And as it rose up, of course, many, many changes occurred, whether it was changes in terms of climate. As the mountains rose higher, the summits became covered in snow. And then as we went through successive ice ages, there was a global cooling. So the Himalaya ultimately became this landscape that was covered in ice and snow. Now, one of the fascinating things about that is the fact that the Himalaya have so much ice and snow, we refer to them as the water towers of Asia because they are an enormous reservoir of moisture. And as most of us will recognize, that moisture is the source of life. So there are many, many ways in which that moisture nurtures the emergence of different species. It supports plant life, insect life, bird life, and the mammals as well. And we, again, often think of this as sort of static landscape, but the truth of it is that, in fact, everything in the mountains is moving. And these insects, birds, mammals are all migrating. They may migrate kilometer up or down, or they may migrate hundreds of kilometers, and in some cases, thousands of kilometers. So life itself is moving. One of the things that is perhaps of most concern to conservationists like myself is the effects of climate change on the Himalaya. And probably the most evident example of the consequences of climate change is the retreating of glaciers. Now, one of the things that I always stress in whatever I'm writing is that global warming or climate change, or whatever name you give it, has been happening for thousands of years. 10,000 years ago, when the last ice age ended, the glaciers began to retreat, the snow caps began to retreat. And what happened then was that the plants began to move upward, moving into those spaces vacated by the ice. And of course, other forms of life, they also migrated upwards. And human beings too, who entered the Himalaya perhaps about 8,000 years ago, 9,000, we're not exactly sure. But they came as nomadic hunters in pursuit of prey. And so they too were migrating up into the mountains. And so if you start looking at these mountain landscapes as a place of constant change, of constant flux, you suddenly realize that these landscapes are not perhaps as eternal as we imagine. Of course, they will be there for millions of years. Perhaps they will even outlast our own species. But the truth is that these mountains are constantly moving. They will change even within our own lifetime. Even if we can't see those glaciers move, even if we can't see those snow caps recede, every year they are moving just that little bit. Even Mount Everest, if you read the papers, even today there were articles about how it was a fraction of a centimeter taller than it was some years ago. And that is an example of the way in which these mountains are in flux, in movement.
Last but not the least, Himalayas have been a constant source of attraction for pilgrims and mountain and the holidays, of course. In this pursuit for leisure, sport, religious fervor, it has also led to some degradation of the Himalayas, a lot of destruction in its own way. What is your appeal to these people?
You are absolutely correct that all of these pursuits are having a detrimental effect on the Himalaya. One of the fascinating things about this year, depressing and discouraging though it has been, is that the COVID-19 crisis has given the Himalaya something of a reprieve. Far, far fewer pilgrims have visited sites like Gangotri or Kedarnath. Far fewer mountaineers have gone up mountains like Everest, and far fewer tourists have traveled into hinterland to visit scenic spots. So in a sense, this year is a good illustration of the way in which the absence of pilgrims, mountaineers, tourists gives the mountains some breathing space. So I think that one of the things that must happen in the Himalaya is some form of planning when it comes to religious tourism, other forms of tourism, and certainly, as we've seen on Everest, there needs to be some level of control on the number of mountaineers that are permitted to climb up those slopes, because ultimately you end up with traffic jams at each point. It's just too many people, and we need to be able to control access in a planned, measured, and equitable manner.
It is said that if man respects nature, nature will respect man. So are we to, at the end, conclude that each time that these mountains have roared, shown their fury on man, has it been because we have enraged them?
Well, I would look at it slightly differently. I think I would come to the same conclusion that you're implying. But I think man has to understand that he or she is part of nature. Each of us has to recognize the fact that we belong to a much larger web of life, whether it's in the Himalayas or other parts of the world. And if we can finally at some point understand that we are not simply a dominant species, but we are one of many species, dominant species, which allows us to cut down trees. Whereas, in fact, if we looked upon the forest as essentially an equivalent life form, we might not be quite so quick to cut that forest down. We, in a sense, share a living bond with those creatures. My answer to it is not so much that nature is taking a revenge on us. We, in a sense, through our arrogance and by setting ourselves apart from nature, are, in a sense, dooming ourselves fate that we have brought upon other species as well, because our survival depends on their survival.
Mr. Alter, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You just heard Stephen Alter, a well-known writer on the Himalayas. In conversation with him was Kiran Mishra. This broadcast came to you from All India Radio, Delhi.